Hey guys, so I'm here in front of the Alpha sculpture. So before you guys start doing this project, I think it's important that you guys come out here to the sculpture park, walk around and go through the list. I think there's 7 different sculptures that you guys can choose from, and I think it's important to actually look at them before you pick which one you want to draw. So I think you'll enjoy the project more if you pick one that interests you. The other thing to think about is some of these are going to be more complex and they're going to take longer to draw than others. So depending upon your level of confidence with drawing at this stage, you might want to pick one that's easier, or if you have experience with orthographic drawing, you might want to pick one that's a little more complex to challenge yourself. So I'm going to walk you guys through sort of how to approach drawing something in the field, especially with a sculpture like this one. The Alpha sculpture has some complexity to it, so I want you guys to start to think about how to represent this both in perspective and orthographically with some accuracy. So I've got some of the things you guys are going to need when you come out here to measure your sculpture. So you're going to need your notebook. You're going to need a tape measure. We can provide one that you can pick up from the school. I recommend a 25-foot one, but if you have something that's at least 16 feet for most of these, that'll probably work fine. The other thing that I recommend, so I made what I would call a kind of plumb bob. So it's not a true plumb bob, but it works the same. So I've got a large washer with a piece of string tied to it. Bringing another piece of string might be helpful to you guys out here as well. The other thing that I brought was some change, and the reason why I brought this change, it doesn't cost any money to come out here, but we do want to you want to have the ability to lay down markers to indicate where certain points are, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to keep track of where, when you use your plumb bob to figure out where things come to project those points onto the ground, where they actually are. So that'll help you keep track of some of that stuff. The other thing to keep in mind as you start to draw these sculptures, so most of them have signs posted by them. You're not supposed to climb on them. You're really not even supposed to touch them. We want to be good guests here at the Laumeier Sculpture Park. So the first step to drawing one of these things is you need to have a reference point that everything is going to be in relationship to. And to some extent, that's a little bit of an arbitrary decision, but there's probably some reference points that are going to work better than others. And this is what you're going to be measuring everything in relation to. And a lot of what we're going to be doing with a sculpture like this, so it's all straight lines and flat planes, but because of the angles and the geometry of it, basically we're going to be plotting points on a Cartesian grid. So for right now, for the purpose of this bottom corner right here, this is going to be our benchmark. So it's a corner on it. It's not all the way on the very edge of the piece, but it is an edge, and we're going to use that point. So what we'll do is we'll mark in our notebook is where that point is, and then I'm going to use my tape measure, and I'm going to measure this length. And right here, so I've got a measurement of 16 feet, 5.5 inches. So this whole sculpture is approximately 40 feet long. It's about 11 feet wide. So we now know this sculpture is about 40 feet by 11 feet. We have a single edge here that we can use as a reference benchmark as we start to draw this out, and that's going to help us decide how many squares in our notebook equals 1 foot. So this point right here is the benchmark I referred to, and then I've drawn a line that's 16.5 squares long, representing 16.5 feet. So I'm doing that on grid, and everything else is going to be in relationship to that. So I'm going to measure each of the important datums across here. dimension and write them down in my notebook right now before I forget. So I've got those measurements here, and I can start to interpolate where those lines belong. So these are my two outer edges, and then I'll have to find the two inner edges to. And what that's going to do is it's going to help us interpolate the angle of those lines relative to that first edge. We've got our benchmark established, and we've measured that length, so we have a single reference line. Now what I want to do is I want to measure the width of this, and I'm not going to just measure from corner to corner like this. I want this to be perpendicular, or at least appear perpendicular. It might not be perfect, but I want to get it close. So I've set my tape measure, I've checked it over here. So this is at 6 feet across, even. So it's almost like they planned it out. But because this end sticks out a little bit further, so I'm going to use one of my coins here. I'm going to mark where this is. That way when I undo my tape measure, I'll have that as a reference point. And we have another 9 inches. So I'm going to leave that reference point there for now, and I'll make a note of that. One thing that's important to know is we want to be accurate, but with doing something like this, with the tools that we have, it's not going to be totally precise. So if you can get to within about an inch or so of accuracy on your dimensions, that's probably going to be fine, because we're basically drawing one little square equals 1 foot. So what I measured here was from the outer to the inner leg of this side here is about 30 inches, and then here on this side, again, always measuring perpendicular to that face, it's about 15 inches. So I can measure relative to those reference lines that I've set up. The other thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to use my washer and my string, because what we want to do is we want to figure out where this point is, because it hangs out into space, right? And it's not in the middle, you can tell just by looking at it. So we want to figure out where this is relative to everything else here. So this is acting like a plumb bob. So a plumb line, you can tell the wind's blowing it some, but a plumb line is perpendicular to a level horizontal plane. That's what that is. So it's straight up and down, irrespective of what the slope of the ground is doing or anything else. So it's a little bit windy out here, so you've got to bear with me for a second. But that's about where it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use another coin now. I'm going to mark that spot. Now I can come back and I can measure. So one way to think about it would be that that benchmark point is our origin, 0, 0, 0, right? And X would be our left-right dimension, Y would be in the depth of space, and Z would be the height. So that's another way to think about it. And so what we're doing is we're finding these points, and then we're drawing lines to connect them, and those tell us where surfaces and edges are. Plotting points on a Cartesian grid. So we're going to come down here, 5, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're going to come over about 1.5. So that's where that peak is, right? And so the shape of this is starting to become more and more clear to us as we go. So some of these things you're not going to be able to see, like the inside of this, because it's covered by the top surface. So the way we're going to represent that is with a broken or a hidden line. So right now we're drawing a top view of this, but when we come back to construct a plan of it, that location and information is going to be really important. So we've started to plot out different points on this. We have a lot of this understood now, and we're getting to a point where we've got certain points that we cannot drop a plumb bob from that, because we can't, there's an interior fold here, and there's there's no way to stand there, and that plumb bob can't go down. What we're left with at a certain point is trying to estimate where this is through taking other measurements, right? So we might be able to come straight down here, figure out where that is, and try to make sense of where that point is, and also take vertical measurements to try to understand it. But if I just hold my tape measure up here and I'm looking at it, it might look like I'm seeing where that point is, but I'm looking up at it at an angle. So you need to start to try to find ways to measure stuff or to figure out what those things are. And again, this is not going to be perfectly accurate, but I want you guys to do the best that you can to try to make sense of where that point is three-dimensionally in space. First to locate it in a top view, but then we're going to use all the same information that we've already collected for this top view to start to draw the vertical elevation basis of this sculpture.